It's 2 a.m. The world outside is quiet, almost too quiet, save for the soft hum of your radio. You flick the dial, settling on the one station that keeps you awake at night. The voice that greets you is deep, raspy, and filled with secrets. This is no ordinary radio show. It's a late-night paranormal broadcast where listeners call in to share their encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Tonight, we dive into the creepiest stories sent to us from all over the world. Stories of things that linger in the shadows, whispers from the other side, and terror that lingers even after the clock strikes dawn. These are the tales that have made us question what's real and what's imagined. So, if you're brave enough, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and listen closely to what follows. The unsettling beginnings. Sarah had always been a cautious woman, preferring to stay in familiar places, surrounded by people she trusted. But when she decided to move into a small, charming house at the edge of town, she thought a change of scenery would be good for her. The house was old, too old maybe, but it had its charm. The creaky floorboards, the antique fixtures, the smell of dust that came with age. It was the kind of place you'd find in an old mystery novel. At first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah to feel that something was off. It wasn't the house itself, it was something else. A strange feeling that followed her around like being watched, even when no one was there. It started small, a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision when she was alone. A faint whisper like the sound of someone breathing just behind her when she was standing still. But it wasn't until the basement that things started to get really weird. The basement. Sarah had always hated basements. She'd grown up in a house with a dark, damp basement, and the memories of that place always made her uneasy. But when she moved in, she realized she had no choice but to use the basement for storage. The house didn't have a lot of room, and her things were starting to pile up. The basement door was heavy, creaking each time it opened. The stairs led down into near darkness, and even though she had a light switch at the top of the stairs, it never seemed to illuminate the whole space. The walls felt closer, and the air was thicker, almost suffocating. But Sarah had to put things away, so she went down there, despite the unease that tugged at her heart. And that's when she noticed it. The shadow. It wasn't there when she first entered. The basement was empty. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the thud of her own footsteps on the concrete floor. But when she went to turn back toward the stairs, there was something there, lurking in the corner. A shape, a figure. She couldn't make out details, but it was tall, maybe 7 feet, with broad shoulders. Sarah froze. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She stepped closer, squinting, but the figure was gone. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light, but the feeling of dread remained. The motion detector. It wasn't until a few nights later that Sarah's fear turned into something real. She was alone in the house enjoying a quiet evening when she heard a sudden beep from her phone. It was a notification from her home security system, motion detected in the basement. Her heart skipped a beat. She was sure she had locked the basement door before going to bed. The notification seemed to taunt her, repeating, "Motion detected, basement." She checked the live feed from the camera that was mounted in the basement. At first it was just static, then the image cleared up. There, standing in the corner of the basement, was the figure. It was taller than before, its form more defined, almost like it was waiting for something. It didn't move, it didn't do anything, but it was there. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed the phone and dialed the police. Her voice shook as she tried to explain the situation, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. The basement was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there. But when they checked the security footage, something strange had been recorded. There, in the corner of the basement, was the shadow, a perfect, solid figure, but it wasn't moving, it wasn't breathing, it was just standing. The police couldn't explain it. They dismissed it as a glitch in the camera or some kind of malfunction. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For the next few days, she tried to go about her life, but the sensation of being watched never left her. Every time she passed the basement door, her skin would crawl. Every time she went near the stairs, she would feel a cold, invisible hand pressing against her chest, urging her to stay away. One evening, a week later, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She stood in front of the basement door, staring at it, her hand shaking as she turned the doorknob. She had to know what was down there. She had to face whatever it was. With each step down the stairs, the air grew colder. It felt heavier, thicker. The basement felt like a different place at night, almost like the walls were closing in on her. When she reached the bottom, she saw the familiar outline of the corner. But something was different. The shadow was gone, but something else stood in its place. It was a person, a tall man dressed in dark clothes. his face hidden in the shadows. His posture was stiff, as if he had been waiting for her, watching her every move. He didn't speak, he just stared, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Sarah couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place. The man didn't seem to notice her at first. His attention focused on something else, on the corner, on the floor, as if he was looking for something. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. "I've been waiting," he whispered. "I won't let you leave." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't run. She couldn't. Something about his presence held her in place, like she was trapped in a nightmare. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. When Sarah finally snapped out of her trance, the basement was empty once again. She ran upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest, slamming the door behind her. She called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There was no sign of him. There was no trace of anything unusual. But Sarah knew. She knew he wasn't gone. For days after that, she avoided the basement. She didn't want to go near it, didn't want to face whatever was down there. But one night, the sound of footsteps from below brought her to the door. She couldn't resist any longer. When she opened the door, the basement was empty, but the motion sensor went off again. The footage showed the man standing in the same corner, his eyes glinting at the camera. And this time, he was smiling. Ben had never been one to believe in the supernatural. He was a man of logic, of reason. So when he bought his new house, a charming little place on the outskirts of town, he dismissed the rumors of the old oak tree in the backyard. Locals would whisper about it, claiming it was cursed or haunted, but Ben paid no mind. Trees were trees, and a little superstition was nothing more than small-town folklore. But there was something about the tree that made him uneasy. It wasn't its size, it was vast, towering over the house like a sentinel, but it was the way it seemed to loom, even when the wind wasn't blowing. Something about the branches, twisted and gnarled, always felt like they were reaching out for him, like they were trying to get his attention. But Ben shrugged it off. He had bigger things to worry about, like settling into his new home. It was a few days after he moved in when he first heard the whispers. The first night Ben had stayed up late, unpacking and trying to make his new place feel like home. The sun had long set, and the only light in the house came from the flickering of his desk lamp. He had just finished arranging the last of the books when he thought he heard something, a faint rustling noise outside, like someone brushing against the tree. But when he peered out the window, the tree was still. He turned away, chalking it up to the wind. But then, just before he closed his eyes to sleep, he heard it again, a voice, quiet, like a distant whisper, but unmistakably there. "Ben," he sat up, confused. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice echoing in the silence of the house. But the only sound that followed was the soft rustling of leaves, almost like the tree was responding. The next few days passed in a haze. Ben tried to get used to the sounds of the house, but each night the whispers grew louder. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The whispers were always there, drifting through the walls, curling around his thoughts. He would hear them faintly, like a voice carried on the wind, calling his name. But when he stepped outside to check, there was no one there. Just the tree, its branches swaying ever so slightly. One evening, driven by a mixture of curiosity and fear, Ben decided to confront the source of the whispers. He grabbed a flashlight, slipped into his jacket, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The moment his feet touched the grass, he felt it, the overwhelming sense that he wasn't alone. The whispers seemed to surround him, like they were coming from the tree itself. He aimed the flashlight toward the oak, its massive trunk looming in the darkness. "Ben," the voice called again, closer this time. He froze. He could hear the whispering more clearly now. The tree, it was speaking to him, but the words weren't his name anymore. They were other names too. His mother's, his father's, his little sister's. Ben's heart raced, his breath coming in short bursts. He stepped forward, drawn by the voice, despite every warning in his mind telling him to turn back. The light from the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the tree's gnarled branches. As he stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice he didn't recognize. "Come closer, Ben. We're waiting." Ben stumbled back in shock, his feet tangling in the grass as he tried to turn and run. But something held him in place. The flashlight dropped from his hands, and the beam illuminated the ground for a brief moment before flickering out completely. His eyes strained to see in the dark, but he couldn't make out any details. Only the darkness, wrapping itself around him like a thick blanket. Then, through the dark, he saw it. A shape, tall, indistinct, with a figure that seemed to be moving slowly toward him. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, and at the forefront was that strange voice again. "Ben, we've been waiting for you." He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, and his legs refused to carry him. The figure took another step forward, and that's when Ben saw it clearly for the first time. The eyes, they were black, hollow, empty, staring directly at him. The voice, now unmistakably deep, low and cold, echoed in his mind, "You shouldn't have come." With a jolt, Ben snapped back to his senses. He turned and ran, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, couldn't afford to. All he could hear was the voice, now laughing softly behind him. The ground felt uneven beneath his feet as he stumbled toward the house. He reached the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind him. Ben collapsed against the door, gasping for air, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the image of the figure, the hollow eyes that seemed to follow him even now. He couldn't explain what had happened. It didn't make sense. But one thing was clear, something about that tree wasn't right. The next morning, Ben found himself standing in front of the oak tree again, despite the fear that gripped him. The whispers were gone, but the tree was still there, towering over him. It looked like any other tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky, the bark rough and weathered, yet something about it still unsettled him. He noticed something new, a faint carving in the bark, just below the first branch. It was too small to notice at first, but as he leaned closer, he could make out the shape of a hand, long and thin, carved into the wood. Ben stepped back, his stomach churning. That hand, was it always there? Or had it appeared after that night? There was no way to tell. As the days went on, Ben tried to ignore the strange sensation he couldn't shake. The whispers didn't come every night, but they never stopped. Sometimes when the wind blew, he thought he could hear them again, like faint whispers just beyond his hearing. They seemed to surround him, speaking of things that were impossible to understand. Ben knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay there any longer. He couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't understand the connection between the tree and the voices. But he knew the truth now. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a place where something ancient was waiting, watching, and it was never going to let him go. It all began when Emily moved into the old, inherited house she had been given after her grandmother's passing. The house, nestled on the edge of town, had always been a place of mystery. Her grandmother had lived in it for decades, always insisting that there was something special about it, a place where memories lingered long after people were gone. The house was quaint, old-fashioned, with creaky floors and a faint, musty smell of dust and forgotten times. But there was one item that caught Emily's attention almost immediately, an antique mirror hanging in the hallway. It wasn't particularly large, but it had a presence. The glass seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly gleam, unlike any mirror she had seen before. Its ornate wooden frame, intricately carved with twisted vines, looked as if it had been crafted by a master artisan. Her grandmother had always been quiet about the mirror, but Emily couldn't help but wonder why it had been given such a prominent place in the house. It wasn't like the other furniture. There was something different about it, almost as if it belonged to another time. On her first night in the house, Emily felt drawn to it. She stood before the mirror, expecting her reflection to be the same as always. Familiar, mundane, but as she stared into it, something wasn't right. Her reflection seemed to flicker like a faulty television screen, and for a brief moment, it almost looked wrong, as if the image of herself in the mirror was not her own. Shaking the feeling off, she dismissed it as tiredness and went to bed. But that night, she couldn't shake the sense that something was watching her. Something that wasn't entirely human. The strange occurrences. Over the following days, Emily began to notice small oddities about the mirror. Sometimes when she walked past it, she would catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, even though the hallway was empty. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the strange occurrences became too frequent to ignore. The reflection in the mirror didn't always match her actions. One evening, as she passed by, her reflection stayed staring at her, even though Emily had moved to the kitchen. Just a trick of the light, Emily muttered to herself, trying to brush it off. But the sense of unease continued to grow. On the third night, Emily couldn't sleep. The house was completely silent, save for the occasional creak of the old beams shifting under the weight of time. As she tossed and turned in bed, a faint noise, almost like a whisper, drifted through the hallway. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded almost like breathing, steady and deliberate. Her heart raced as she got out of bed and slowly made her way to the hallway, her footsteps soft against the worn carpet. The mirror glimmered faintly in the moonlight that poured through the window. Emily stood before it, staring into her own eyes. For a moment, everything was still, but then, as though in answer to the breath-like whisper, her reflection smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that wasn't hers. Frozen, Emily backed away, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection in the mirror slowly began to change. Her image began to twist, as though it was no longer just a reflection. The face in the glass seemed to stretch, distort, and shift like something that wasn't bound by the laws of reality. Emily blinked, and the mirror returned to normal, but she could still feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The truth behind the mirror. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily began to search through her grandmother's old belongings. She rifled through drawers and dusty boxes until she found a worn journal buried beneath a stack of papers. It was her grandmother's, and after flipping through the pages, she found the entry that explained everything. The journal told a story of an ancient mirror, a mirror that could see beyond the surface. According to the entry, the mirror was said to possess the ability to show not just the reflection of a person, but their deepest fears, secrets, and desires. It was rumored that the mirror had been passed down through generations, each one becoming more aware of its power as time went on. Her grandmother's journal spoke of how the mirror was never meant to be used as a simple object of vanity. It was a gateway, a portal to something darker. "The mirror sees you, child," the last entry read, "but it also shows others what they wish to see, and sometimes what they wish for is far more dangerous than you can imagine." Emily shivered, closing the journal. She tried to rationalize it. Surely it was just an old superstition, an eerie tale woven into the fabric of family history. But as she stood up to return the journal to its hiding place, she heard it again, the whisper, "Come closer, Emily." Her heart stopped in her chest. The voice was coming from the mirror. It was soft, almost inviting, but there was something about it that made her bones ache with fear. Her reflection in the mirror was smiling again, not the soft, innocent smile of herself, but something far more sinister. The grin stretched impossibly wide, and Emily's eyes filled with dread as the reflection began to move on its own, slowly reaching out toward the edge of the mirror. The glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. "Don't look away," the voice murmured. Frozen in place, Emily couldn't tear her eyes from the mirror. Her reflection reached further out, its fingers coming ever closer to the frame, as though it were stretching out of the glass toward her. The final encounter. In a moment of pure terror, Emily turned and ran from the mirror, not stopping until she reached the front door. She could feel the cold breath of the reflection behind her, like a phantom presence chasing her every step. She bolted out into the yard, but when she turned to look back at the house, she saw it. The mirror, now standing alone in the front window, its glass glowing faintly. It wasn't just her reflection she saw now. The faces of hundreds of people filled the mirror, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They were reaching for her, their hands clawing at the glass, begging to escape. Emily ran faster, as fast as she could, not daring to look back. But no matter how far she went, she could always feel the mirror watching her, its cold, unblinking gaze following her wherever she went. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew that the mirror wasn't done with her yet. The next time it called her name, she might not be able to resist. The mirror never forgets. As time passed, Emily left the house behind, but the mirror never left her mind. No matter how far she traveled, no matter how many places she moved to, she would always find herself drawn back to its cold, reflective surface in the quietest moments. And in those moments, she could still hear it, the whispers, the breathing, the reflection that wasn't her own, and the terrifying thought that one day it might pull her back in. It started innocently enough. Mark, a radio enthusiast and a regular listener of late-night shows, had always loved the eerie feeling that crept in the air when the rest of the world was asleep. There was something about the darkness of night that made the stories and voices on the radio feel more real, more intense. He often found himself tuning in to late-night paranormal radio shows, the ones that shared tales of hauntings, mysterious disappearances, and things that went bump in the night. One particular evening, while adjusting the old radio dial in his room, Mark stumbled upon a station he had never heard before. The signal was weak at first, crackling and flickering, but then, as if the radio had come alive, a voice emerged from the static. "You're listening to Whispers in the Dark, where we explore the unsolved, the paranormal, and the unexplained. But tonight it's different. We've got a story just for you, Mark." He was sure he had never heard this particular show before, and yet the voice seemed to know him, specifically him. Who is this?" Mark whispered, his fingers trembling over the dial. But the voice didn't answer right away. The static grew louder, and for a moment, he could hear nothing but the hiss of the radio, as though it was fighting with itself. Then, with a voice that was both familiar and unfamiliar at once, it spoke again. "Mark, don't you recognize me?" It's been so long. Mark's stomach churned. There was something hauntingly familiar about the voice. It sounded almost like his mother's voice, soft and warm, yet there was an underlying coldness to it, a chilling edge that he couldn't ignore. "Mom," Mark gasped, his voice barely a whisper, but the response that came was not what he expected. "Mark, I'm sorry, but I had to leave you. I had to go, but you'll see me again soon." The radio hissed again, louder now, and Mark's heart raced. His mother had passed away 2 years ago in a tragic accident. He had never truly gotten over her death, and hearing her voice again, hearing it on the radio, was enough to make his knees go weak. How is this even possible? Mark muttered aloud, his eyes wide with disbelief. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it continued, speaking in riddles, making cryptic statements that seemed to echo off the walls of his room. The words were tangled, and every time Mark tried to make sense of them, they slipped away like water through his fingers. "I have to leave, Mark, but before I go, there's something you need to know. It's not over. It's never over." Mark tried to turn the radio off, but the dial refused to move. His hands shook violently as he twisted it, but the voice on the other end persisted. It wasn't just his mother's voice anymore. There were others too, more whispers, more voices that sounded distorted and wrong, all layered on top of each other. "Mark, listen closely. You're being watched." He could feel the air around him growing colder, his breath visible in the dim light of his room. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. He began to feel a growing sense of dread, as though he was no longer alone in his room, even though he knew he was. The voices on the radio began to take on new tones, as though they were aware of him, aware of everything about him. With each passing second, they grew more insistent. "I know where you are, Mark. I know what you're doing. I can see you." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He darted to the window, expecting to see someone, something, anything. But the street outside was empty, bathed in the silence of the early morning hours. Yet the voices continued, growing louder and more frantic. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" Mark screamed, his hands trembling as they clutched the radio. The voice on the other end simply laughed. It was a low, guttural sound, like something alive on the other side of the static. "You can't escape. Not from me, not from the ones who are listening." Mark's vision blurred. His mind felt like it was being pulled into the radio, as though the voices were not just speaking to him. They were reaching into him, pulling at the very fabric of his sanity. Mark's breath was ragged, his head spinning as the whispers grew louder. He tried one last time to turn the radio off, but this time, it wasn't the radio that answered. The voice came from inside the room, from behind him. "Mark, it's time," a familiar voice whispered softly, like a breath on his neck. Mark spun around, his heart almost stopping in his chest. There, standing in the doorway of his room, was a figure. It was too dark to make out the details at first, but then the light from the radio cast a long shadow, revealing the face of the figure. It was his mother, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. She stepped forward, her mouth twisting into an unsettling smile. "I've been waiting for you, Mark. We all have." The room around him seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing deeper. He could feel them all. The voices, the ones from the radio, the ones that weren't human, they were all here, standing right behind him. And then the radio clicked off. The voices fell silent, leaving only the deafening quiet. But Mark knew better than to trust the silence. He knew that the voices were not gone. They were still watching, still waiting. He couldn't escape them. Not now, not ever. As the final click of the radio echoed in the stillness, Mark's mother, if it even was her, whispered one final message in his ear. "You're part of the show now, Mark, and you'll never leave." Mark never spoke again. The radio was found, unplugged, the dial turned to an empty frequency, but nothing was ever quite the same after that night. People in the neighborhood began to speak of him, of how he'd disappeared without a trace. Some say they hear his voice on the radio now, late at night, whispering through the static. His name still echoes on those haunting broadcasts, a reminder that once you listen to whispers in the dark, you may never leave. Imagine walking into a dimly lit room, your heart pounding only to feel the icy grip of an unseen force. What if I told you there are moments when the paranormal doesn't just make its presence known but is caught on camera for the world to see? Tonight we dive into the bone-chilling realm of real-life ghost sightings, piecing together terrifying stories captured in pixels and sound. But be warned, what you're about to witness might haunt you forever. In a small, run-down motel tucked away in the heart of Texas, there's a room whispered about in hushed tones. Room 306. For years, staff and guests alike avoided it whenever they could. The stories were endless, lights flickering, strange tapping on walls, and a suffocating chill that lingered even on the hottest days. But things took a sinister turn when a guest decided to stay the night, armed with a camera to document the strange occurrences. The footage begins innocently enough, the man setting up his camera, adjusting the dim lighting, and nervously chuckling as he describes the eerie reputation of the room. Hours pass, and nothing happens. Until it does. At exactly 3:06 a.m., the camera begins to glitch. The sound of faint humming fills the room, coming from the direction of the window. When the man pans the camera toward the source, it captures something no one can explain. A woman in a tattered white gown, her back turned, her hair, dark and matted, flows unnaturally, as though underwater. As the man calls out, the figure jerks, her movements unnerving, like a puppet with tangled strings. She turns, revealing a face smeared in shadows, her hollow eyes seeming to stare straight through the lens. The footage abruptly cuts off as the man screams, his voice echoing in the silent halls of the motel. The next morning, staff found the room empty, the bed untouched. The camera left on the nightstand contained the chilling footage. Paranormal investigators who reviewed the tape claim the woman might be a restless spirit, possibly someone who met a tragic end in room 306. Others suggest it could be something darker, a malevolent entity drawn to the energy of fear. To this day, no one stays in room 306. The footage remains a haunting testament to its ghostly inhabitant, daring skeptics and believers alike to confront the unknown. Some say shadows are just tricks of the light, but what if they aren't? What if, in the darkest corners of an abandoned place, shadows take on a life of their own? That's what a group of teenagers discovered one fateful night when they dared to explore the basement of an old church in Kentucky. The church, long deserted, was already shrouded in mystery. Locals spoke of strange happenings, a choir of whispers that echoed after midnight, doors creaking on their own, and a shadowy figure glimpsed near the basement stairs. Dismissing the stories as small-town folklore, the teenagers armed themselves with flashlights and a single camera, determined to prove there was nothing to fear. The basement was a labyrinth of crumbling walls, forgotten relics, and dust so thick it hung in the air like fog. The camera captured their nervous chatter as they descended the creaking staircase. At first, everything seemed normal, if not a little unsettling. The flashlight beams danced across old hymnals, broken furniture, and cobweb-covered statues. But then it started, a faint scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the stone floor. The group paused, their laughter silenced by an instinctual dread. The camera turned toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, thicker, and more alive. As the light flickered over the area, a shape began to emerge. It wasn't a person, nor was it entirely human. The shadow seemed to ripple and slither, detaching itself from the walls and pooling into a tall, featureless figure. One of the teenagers whispered, "It's just a trick of the light." But even as they said it, the figure moved. Fast, it darted toward them, silent but undeniably real. The camera shook violently as the group screamed, their footsteps echoing wildly as they scrambled up the stairs. The last thing captured on the camera was the shadow stretching across the floor, reaching for them. When the teenagers burst out of the church, their faces were pale, their breaths ragged. They swore never to return, but the footage they captured told a different story. Paranormal investigators studied the video frame by frame, trying to explain the phenomenon. Some claimed it was a shadow entity, a being that exists in a plane just outside our perception. Others believed it was a manifestation of the fear and energy the group brought into the basement. To this day, the church remains abandoned, the basement sealed off, but those who pass by late at night sometimes claim they see a figure in the windows, dark, silent, and watching. Perhaps the shadow waits for another group brave or foolish enough to descend into its lair. What would you do if, in the dead silence of the night, a cry echoed from an empty metro station? For one security guard working the night shift at Delhi's famous metro network, this was not just a question, it was his reality. It began like any other shift. The guard patrolled the station, his flashlight slicing through the dimly lit platforms. It was past midnight, and the trains had stopped running hours ago. The station was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the city outside breaking the stillness. But then, the sound came, soft at first, a faint wail that seemed to seep through the walls. He froze, his pulse quickening as the cry grew louder, more heart-wrenching. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, her voice laced with despair. Gripping his flashlight and phone, the guard followed the sound to the far end of the platform, where shadows danced under the flickering fluorescent lights. He activated his phone's camera, hoping to document the strange occurrence. The video showed the empty platform, but the sobs persisted. As he inched closer, the light of his flashlight fell upon a figure seated at the edge of the tracks. It was a woman draped in a crimson sari, her long black hair cascading down her shoulders. She sat perfectly still, her face obscured by her hair. Trembling, the guard called out to her, asking if she needed help. But she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward him, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul. And then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished. The camera captured her disappearance, a sudden, inexplicable blur, leaving nothing but the stillness of the empty platform. But her wail lingered, echoing through the station, fading only as dawn broke. The footage went viral, sparking debates and investigations. Locals whispered that the woman was the spirit of someone who had tragically ended her life on those very tracks. Some commuters reported seeing her reflection in the train windows late at night, only to find the platform empty when they looked back. Despite multiple investigations, the mystery remains unsolved. Staff and passengers alike avoid that part of the platform after dark, and the station itself has gained a reputation for being haunted. For those who dare to venture there late at night, the question isn't if they'll hear the cries, it's whether they'll see her too. Is she a restless soul seeking closure, or is she something far more sinister, bound to haunt the living forever? The crying ghost of Delhi's metro station leaves us with a chilling reminder. Not all journeys end when the train stops. Would you watch a live stream if you knew something horrifying was about to happen? A group of paranormal enthusiasts learned the hard way when they decided to broadcast their investigation of a so-called haunted doll that had terrified its previous owners. The doll, an antique with faded glass eyes and a chipped porcelain face, was rumored to be cursed. But the group dismissed the warnings, seeing it as an opportunity to grow their audience. The stream began with excitement and banter. The group of 4 investigators set up cameras in a dimly lit room, placing the doll in the center of a round table. Thousands of viewers tuned in, eager to witness the supposed supernatural activity. For the first hour, nothing happened. The team cracked jokes, interacted with the audience, and dismissed the doll as just another overhyped artifact. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to grow colder, and the doll's blank stare appeared unnervingly lifelike under the flickering candlelight. The group began to notice subtle movements, its head slightly tilted, its tiny hand shifted an inch. The viewers in the chat exploded with comments. "Did you see that? The doll moved." Suddenly, the table shook violently, sending the cameras wobbling. One of the investigators reached out to steady the doll, but as soon as his hand touched it, he recoiled, screaming. "It's burning hot," he shouted, showing the angry red mark forming on his palm. Panic set in as the candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. The live stream continued, capturing frantic whispers, footsteps, and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. When the lights flickered back on, the doll was no longer on the table. It was standing upright on the floor, its glassy eyes locked onto the camera. The group tried to end the live stream, but the equipment wouldn't respond. The chat grew hysterical as viewers reported strange occurrences in their own homes. Objects falling, doors creaking, and eerie whispers coming from their screens. It was as if the doll's curse was spreading through the broadcast itself. In the final minutes of the stream, the camera captured the doll's head turning toward one of the investigators. A chilling, childlike giggle echoed through the room as the screen abruptly went black. The live stream ended, leaving thousands of viewers staring at their screens, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The next day, news broke that the group of investigators had vanished without a trace. Their equipment was found in the room, still recording, but the footage contained only static. The doll, too, was gone. The live stream became infamous, dubbed the Haunted Doll Broadcast, and many claimed it was cursed. Those who watched it reported nightmares, strange sounds, and unexplained phenomena in their homes. Some even said they could hear the faint giggle of the doll in the dead of night. To this day, the doll's whereabouts remain unknown, and its story serves as a warning. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. In their pursuit of views and thrills, the investigators unleashed something far more terrifying than they could have imagined. So, next time you stumble upon a live stream claiming to capture the paranormal, ask yourself, do you really want to see what lies on the other side? You may not like what stares back. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey through real-life ghost encounters. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will haunt your nights. And remember, the line between the living and the dead is thinner than you think. Sweet dreams, if you dare.